2 of those Sundays, I believe, out of the 7. And so I had taken the approach of some of the practical aspects based on what rules and laws and the state of medicine is in terms of death and dying. And I had a reference book, and Deckard, I think, challenged us with more of the spiritual, and is your soul ready to die? Little did we know about this COVID thing at the time. It was, I think, in the news, but we had no idea. So the timing, I hope, was appropriate. For those who do not know me, I'm Bill Kaufman. I'm one of the ruling elders. I'm a family doctor by training, and I've done hospice for over 20 years. I don't know how many years, a good many. We had found this book, Departing in Peace, and we had done it as part of our small group Bible study, probably in the fall or the summer of 2019, and decided it would be good for a Sunday school class, so that's what we did in January of 2020. I think it is extremely appropriate, and I think we can contextualize it a little bit better now. One thing about current day America prior to 2020 is we didn't talk much about death. We're not exposed to death. If you see death in the TV or in the movies, it's either glorified or sanitized compared to real life. But I think we've had several people in this congregation who passed away in the last year. Many people that we know of outside of this church has passed away in the last year. So I just want to contextualize all this towards the end when I do my wrap-up. So I don't want this to be a downer for the kids, so I'm going to have to watch myself. The last time I did this, there were no children here, so I'll keep that in mind. So the premise is that everyone in this room at some point, unless it's the second coming, is going to die. And how do we prepare for that at all these different levels? As I said, it's not discussed enough. Even at the secular level, it's not discussed enough. People are poorly prepared when bad things happen. Bad things happen usually as a surprise to people, either through accident or a diagnosis, and you just don't have the time to prepare. So I'm going to challenge you a bit on that. And so much has changed in the field of medicine in the last 50 to 100 years. And that has changed the landscape. So this book, I recommended it a year and a half ago, and I'll recommend it again. It's called Departing in Peace, Biblical Decision Making at the End of Life. And it's written by a guy named Bill Davis, who is a ruling elder in the PCA denomination. And he's a professor at Covenant College on philosophy, also Reformed Theological Seminary. He serves on an ethics committee at one of his local hospitals. He wrote this book because he was challenged on it. He was of the do everything available philosophy. So if there was any chance to save a life, no matter what the cost, both in suffering or in money, he was all for it. And he was challenged by a Christian physician about that position, and as a result, he wrote this book. He has taken the time to come up with different principles that he feels he can defend through Scripture, and I'll just read the headlines of a few of them. There's like 4.5 pages of them, each a small paragraph. For example, he says God's word permits us, gives us permission to decline, life-saving treatment. We have a duty to steward our resources. There's a servant authority to make medical choices, the authority to make choices in advance, family decision-making authority, obligation to accept care. Of course, he's of the human life is precious. He's not advocating any euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide or anything like that. And of course, the whole death and dying issue is at both extremes, isn't it? We have the abortion controversy, and I forget how many children are aborted on average each day, and it's horrible. Everybody in this room who is elderly has a little more decision-making ability than these poor unborn babies. So it's our duty to be active in that decision-making process. So anyway, it's around $15, a very good investment. There's different reasons for the confusion about end-of-life decisions. Even for people who care deeply and are very involved, there's different religious backgrounds that have different views, although that seems to break up into subsets within all the religions, so you can't say all Jews think this and all Catholics think that. And if I did a poll, and I don't have time to today, but if we went around and talked about issues like being on a ventilator or cremation is one that gets people going, there would be a lot of different points of view, even within this room, among serious Christians. Of course, the Bible does not give us word-for-word instruction to help us with a lot of these end-of-life decisions. The technology was not there. The authors of Scripture were not able to comment on when to do what and what's the best thing for this. Some of our church documents, however, the Westminster Confession of Faith, does address it, and I'll just read the shorter catechism. It's question 68, says, what is required in the sixth commandment? And the answer is, the sixth commandment requires all lawful endeavors to preserve our own life and the life of others. I'll read that again. What is required in the sixth commandment? The sixth commandment requires all lawful endeavors to preserve our own life and the life of others. Larger Catechism, question 136. What are the sins forbidden in the sixth commandment? And remember, when you get into the larger catechism, if anyone here thinks that they are without sin and they read the larger catechism, you'll find out otherwise pretty quickly. But the answer to that question is the sins forbidden are, and it lists some, but then at the end it says, the neglecting or withdrawing of the lawful and necessary means of preservation of life. Okay, so if we are to make our end-of-life decisions strictly on the Westminster Catechisms, certainly the language sounds like we should do everything all the time. One of the big issues with critically ill people, and we run into this a lot, if they're on a ventilator, how long do you keep them on a ventilator? And there are times that it is appropriate to withdraw someone from a ventilator, in my opinion. If we were to take the larger catechism strictly at its word, it says the sins forbidden are, and among other things, the withdrawing of the lawful and necessary means of preservation of life. So we'll get back to all that. Our own denomination has addressed this issue, but it's been a while. And in 1988, at their General Assembly, they had a report of the Heroic Measures Committee. So 1988, we could say that medicine as a profession and as a field was pretty modern at that point. It wasn't that long ago. At least to me, it doesn't feel like it was that long ago. They addressed, and this is available online. You can look it up on the internet. And our author, Bill Davis, addresses this and talks about it as well. So this Heroic Measures Committee looked at the larger Catechism question and answer. They acknowledged that Scripture does not give specific instructions on specific issues, like shutting off a ventilator. And of course that makes sense, because if you have someone, let's just say, 95 years old, severe heart and lung disease, compare that person who maybe was on a ventilator for a week to a 50-year-old with a trauma, or perhaps a newborn. Lots of newborns on ventilators to get them started in life. Certainly the answer would be different, we would think, for those three scenarios, and this committee acknowledged that. They said that it is our duty to work out the mind of Christ on these matters. Okay, a lot of discussion there potentially. It gave 18 different principles of application, and they got into the weeds a bit there, talking about pain medication, talking about the paperwork, like living wills and things like that. And when I reviewed that, and again, this is just a summary week here. We took 4 weeks the last time to talk about it, but I disagreed with them about some of the paperwork and pain medication. They were very much opposed to pain medication, for example, if it sedated the person so that they were not able to interact. And in real life, that's extremely difficult at times. Certainly, it's the goal when I do hospice work that if we can keep someone in either mild pain or no pain and keep them alert, oh, that's fabulous. But it's extremely rare that we're able to accomplish that. And I personally tell families and reinforce it with our nurses that if we have to choose one, we're going to keep them out of pain. And again, I encourage us all to have these meaningful conversations with people. Don't wait till the end of life. They do it all the time in the movies or in TV shows, and they have their reunion or their repentance or whatever, and then the patient, and people don't die that way. And it doesn't work out that way in real life. So just have those conversations before, because if I'm the hospice doc, they're going to be comfortable and you might not be able to talk to them. So when we talk about the catechisms and the answers to those questions in terms of what is forbidden, I'm not saying let's update the Westminster Catechisms, but what was things like back then? What was able to be offered to the dying patients back then? There were no hospitals that we think of hospitals now. There was very few medications. Essentially, there was food and there was drink. There was no artificial ways of feeding people. If someone is in a car accident today and their jaw is fractured, we can put a feeding tube in through their stomach and put pretty good nutrition in there to keep someone alive until they get healed up. That was not available back then. The same way, we can put a tube down someone's throat now if they have trouble breathing, and we have a reasonable expectation that they're going to improve. That was not available. Concentrated oxygen that we can use a nasal cannula for, not available. So it was food, water, and holding someone's hand and wiping their nose and keeping them clean and so on that was available. So what the Catechism is saying back in its time was, it is not right to withhold food. It is not right, in fact, it's sinful to withhold water. And there may have been times where someone was suffering grievously, and the caretakers were thinking, well, if we just stop giving them water, they'll pass sooner and suffer less. But according to our Catechism, that was sinful. So now we have CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, that wasn't available then. That was only really invented in the early 60s in many of our lifetimes. The intubation that I talked about, cardiopulmonary bypass machines. And I'm giving you a sense of this just to say these are decisions that people have to make as to whether they want these aggressive treatments. So a bypass machine is what they put you on when you're having heart surgery. We have organ transplants now. That's relatively recent in the grand scheme of history. Kidney dialysis that some of us are very aware of here to take the place, to the best of our ability, of kidney function. We have pacemakers and defibrillators that get implanted in the chest so that it regulates the electrical rhythm of the heart, or if it really acts out, it can give you a shock to get your heart in better rhythm. Antibiotics we take for granted, I think. I'm amazed even in hospice care. Let's say someone's dying of pancreatic cancer, they're barely able to eat, drink, and all that, but yet their family will want a urinary tract infection treated. May or may not be appropriate. If they're suffering because of it, it's certainly reasonable to treat, but we take antibiotics for granted. They were invented in the 40s, 1940s, so less than 100 years ago. Let's see, the cancer treatments have come a long way, from none to surgery to radiation, and now chemotherapy, and now very exquisite chemotherapy. And that's certainly changed in my professional career, where it's more, for most cancers, the chemo is more effective and it has less side effects. The socioeconomic structure has changed in the last 100 to several hundred years. We're more spread out. We don't have multi-generation families living under the same roof like we did, and some of the world still lives that way. We have, because of the way medicine is funded, more money to do aggressive treatment. That's good and bad. Medicare was invented in the 60s. Before that, there was private insurance. Private insurance really got its start around World War II. And before that, people paid cash. Imagine that. So it's easier to spend money that's not yours. I don't know if anybody's noticed that. I enjoy spending other people's money, you know, but is it our Christian duty and right to spend other people's money? And again, we're thinking about aggressive care. There was an old story, I don't know if I told this a year ago, but it was a true story about this guy who was had a lot of health issues, but he was on a ventilator for a while. And, you know, weeks went by, and the hospital bill was hundreds of thousands of dollars, but he lived. Well, the guy was getting better. He was off all the machinery, but he wasn't eating well. So why was he not eating well? Well, they determined that it's because his dentures, because he had lost all the weight, didn't fit well, and because of that, he couldn't eat well. So they said, well, we want to get you new dentures. And he said, absolutely not. That'll cost me $500. So the point of the story is, when it's your money, you tend to hold on to it a little bit more. Hospitals have changed. The hospitals, the way we know them, are less than 100 years old. Even medical schools, 100 to 120 years ago, not so good. To get into a medical school, you wrote a check. And the professors at these medical schools got paid based on how many people wrote checks. So they encouraged people to enter medical school, and it was the standard back then that you could get out of medical school. And of course, it's not like you went to college first and all that. You could be a farmer, a mechanic, a bricklayer, and go to medical school if you wrote the check the next day. Most of those people never touched a patient in the 4 years. It was all books and lectures and all that. And I would say that probably most of what they were taught was wrong. A lot of the things I learned in medical school in the 1980s was wrong. You know, we get updates, we get new information. Back when I'm going down a bunny trail, and I apologize, but back when I was in medical school in the 80s, if they talked about cholesterol, they said, just keep your cholesterol under 240. That's the standard. And by the way, the only way to treat it is this nasty stuff called Questran, which is sort of like Metamucil, only it's worse. The only thing we use Questran for now is to treat diarrhea because it was so constipating as a side effect. But all that to say, there's how many medications out there now to treat cholesterol. We know about good and bad cholesterol, large and small particles, fluffy particles, blah, blah, blah. And so that's just been in my career that we learn more. Hospice didn't exist up until the 60s or 70s, so we have that available. The author talked about quality of life. And we talk about that a lot with end-of-life discussions. And I appreciated the author because his idea is a Christian view of what is quality of life. Most of us, I think, at least with our secular brains on, would say quality of life is seeing our families, traveling, being able to get up in the morning and care for ourselves. I think any good definition of quality of life should include bacon, myself, you know. But you with me, Scott? All right. But Mr. Bill Davis says, quality of life is the ability to enjoy the ordinary means of grace, which includes access to the Word, the sacraments, corporate prayer, and worship. So, of course, a non-Christian is not going to care about this in terms of quality of life discussions, but I would challenge all of you to consider this and just look at our lives and say, okay, what's important to me? And what does that mean towards the end, if we have an end that we see coming, in terms of quality of life, the ability to enjoy the ordinary means of grace. And, you know, that hit me last year when we had to shut this place down for several weeks. How many weeks was it, Deckert, that we did not have anybody in here except the ruling elders?
About 6.
6 weeks. Yeah, so we were able, if you had a computer, to get online and you could hear the word preached and read. The singing certainly wasn't up to muster, was it? Who enjoyed that? It was better than not having it, but it certainly wasn't the same as being in here and hearing the sound bounce off the walls. And I've said it before, but one of the best seats in the house is right up there when I'm a worship leader and the singing is robust. It's the best seat in the house to hear the singing. So based on his definition, we had our quality of life impacted. Now, that doesn't mean life's not worth living and so on, but I just want you to think about that, especially if you're doing end-of-life planning, which anybody over the age of 18 should really address. If you are on your own, paying your own bills, having an income, you should be thinking at some point about end-of-life planning and having a will and so on. So I spent some time last year talking at length about the type of paperwork that's out there, and I'm not going to get into that as much today, but I did encourage people to have the conversations with their loved ones. My cousin and his wife came down Friday night because he owns one of those plastic cars that you saw this weekend driving around, Corvettes. So so he came down for the show, and as we were sitting there for dinner Friday night, I was talking about that we were going to have this class, and I asked them. Now they don't have children, but they're I think Todd just turned 50 years old. They don't have a will. So they've got a lot of stuff. They've got cars and a camper and a nice home and money in the bank, I assume. What happens to that if they're killed on the road today? Probably not what they would want to have happen to it. So I'm not here to promote, that you go to a lawyer and everybody spend money, but you at least have to have the conversations with people, spouses with each other, parents with children, and adult children with parents. At some point, the lawyer probably ought to be involved after the conversation. You want to talk about your quality of life expectations, life goals. It's not uncommon with hospice that people seem to stick around for anniversaries or the birth of a child. But how aggressive a treatment would you want? And again, you cannot come up with every little circumstance. If I have pancreatic cancer, this, if I have lung cancer, this, if I have a stroke, that. Never, here's some non-biblical advice, but it's personal. Never promise anyone that you won't put them in a nursing home. That's what people say. I don't want to ever be in a nursing home. But there may be situations where that is the most compassionate and sometimes the most economic decision you can make. Although nursing homes aren't cheap. Private caregiving is more expensive, however. But please have the conversations. There's something called 5 Wishes that you can get on the internet. I think you have to pay for it. That is a very nice pamphlet and outlines some of the things to talk about. But you can do that or not, but when's the best time to have these conversations? Well, tomorrow would be good, but I recognize they're uncomfortable. We were away last week, and I talked to my daughter, who's the executor of our will, that I was going to change the will soon, and we talked about just the mechanics of that and what we were going to do. but we probably haven't talked well enough to her about what our end-of-life wishes would be in terms of intubation and how aggressive and all that. The author, I think it was this author, said or recommended that pick a significant date. I know Laura Lee and I talked about maybe the middle of February having a conversation, because that's the anniversary of when her father died suddenly and tragically. Of course, that's Valentine's Day too, so who wants to be talking about that in the middle of February? But if you can come up with a date every year that you can review these things, and if it becomes more routine, then it's less onerous. I know our daughter Hannah just throws her hands up in the air when we start talking about death and dying, because she doesn't even want to think about that. Erin is our more focused, non-emotional child, so that's why she's the executor. We talked about palliative care and more what was hospice all about. We talked about nursing facilities and medications and so on last year. I don't have time to get into that. So I'm a doctor, I'm not a lawyer. But again, getting back to the paperwork, if you have children who live in your home that, minor children, and you don't have paperwork saying, here's what happens to our children if the worst happens to us, the courts will likely get involved, and that can never go well. So I don't know what the specific rules are in Pennsylvania. I don't know if they've changed recently, but again, you really don't want the government authorities to be involved with distribution of assets or the worst thing, which is what happens to your children, either temporarily or permanently. Now, I mean, and I get it, it's tough, to go to another family member and say, if something happens to us, would you please raise my 4 children? That's life-changing. But yet, somebody has to raise them. So, okay. So there's such things, there's a will, there's power of attorneys, both medical and financial, that ought to be thought about. And those kick in either when you want them to, or if you're disabled and no longer able to make those decisions. The person who is that power of attorney can be the same person, it can be different people. Some people say, well, I want all my 3 children to be my medical power of attorney. I would advise against that, just because, as everybody that children knows, children think differently. They have different agendas sometimes. You could have a child that says, do everything for mom, and someone else that's looking at an inheritance. And so my advice is to have one person that you have that good relationship with and the good conversations with to make those decisions. And then tell the other kids, just be honest, and so that nobody gets surprised. So once a year, try to have the conversations with either your your parents or your adult children, and get that taken care of. So I did 4 weeks in 40 minutes. That's pretty good. Okay, I'm going to recommend another book. This is not a Christian book. This is called The Great Influenza by John Barry, who is not a physician. This is very readable for people at least 13 and up. Why am I recommending this? This is a book on the Spanish flu that was wrapping up about 100 years ago. All right. Who wants to tell me where the Spanish flu started? Shout it out. China.
It was not Spain.
You are half right. It was not Spain.
It wasn't the United States.
It was in the United States. It was in Kansas. At least that's what we think now. So, what was going on 100 years ago and change that really changed everything, and that was World War I. So the theory is that, and by the way, I'll back up. The reason I'm delving into this is there's been so much angst about COVID and everything surrounding with it. You know, what can we learn from history? And I would say what we've learned from history is very little in terms of how we handled COVID. But I think we all need to learn more history. So, so they think, these people who study viruses, they think that there was a combination of a bird flu and a swine flu. And in, I think it was southwest Kansas, there was an area where the birds migrated through, and there was a lot of pig farms. And that's how these two viruses got together and formed this influenza virus, okay? Now we're dealing with coronavirus today, but this was an influenza virus. And the other thing that was in southwest Kansas was a military boot camp. And so when they have tried to trace it back, it looks like that's where the first cases were. And this was a devastating disease that killed young people, more so than older people. So warfare did a great job of spreading the virus because you have boot camp that was overcrowded. And if the camp was built for 100 people, they had 200 in it. So it's overcrowded, so you spread it very quickly, and then you send these people out. And more Americans, they thought, died of influenza than died from bullets and nerve gas in World War I. So worldwide, and I looked this up, the source of all truth, Google, the current data is it's around 4.5 million people so far have died of COVID. I understand that's complicated. I do death certificates, so it's very seldom that someone dies of one thing if they're elderly. So I don't want to get into an argument today how many people really died of COVID versus something else. But anyway, it's out there. 4.5 million died of COVID. 100 years ago, the estimate is between 50 and 100 million died of the Spanish flu. Whole towns were wiped out. And it hit people so hard and so fast that they weren't able to take care of anybody else. So the whole towns, these rural towns, would be just decimated, and before anybody would get there, passing through, they were gone. They were gone. It affected children and young adults, and they think it was because the more elderly people had already been exposed to a less virulent or less mean strain of the influenza that gave them partial immunity. The younger people, their systems had not seen anything like it, and that's why it affected them so much. Physicians 100 years ago, as I alluded to, were very poorly trained. 100 years ago, they did not know viruses existed. They didn't know what the cause was or how it was spread. People that died of influenza actually died of secondary infections like pneumonias back then. So they were thinking it was just a pneumonia bacteria because they knew about bacteria. Of course, now we have semi-effective treatments. We know a lot more about COVID and the treatment of it than we did a year ago or a year and a half ago. Back in the Spanish flu days, the only thing they had was antitoxins. So you would take the bacteria, inject it into a horse, let them build up antibodies, and then you would take the toxin out, or the antitoxin essentially, and inject it into people. And it was relatively effective, but hard to come by. Hospitals, you may have seen pictures, you know, they have people just row after row after row. They might have sheets in between them. They might have a thin gauze mask on with the caretakers. That was it. I mean, it was just a holding place. The hospitals are a lot better now. As I said, it was spread by World War I. COVID spread partly because we're such a mobile society now. You know, people can get on a plane, and I think when COVID hit Italy early on, that was one of the hot spots. It was actually spread or taken there by a lot of the Chinese. That I didn't know that there was a Chinese contingent in Italy, but evidently there is, and that's how it got introduced to Italy early on. Back 100 years ago, I'm glad you're all sitting down, the government actually suppressed the truth. Can you believe it? So they were fighting a war. They actually had an anti-sedition act that if you did or said anything to affect morale, you could go to jail. So free speech was affected even more then than it is now. I don't know that the truth is necessarily suppressed now, but what you hear, I think, is more agenda-driven, if I could use a couple words. Politics and diseases don't mix well. And I'm thankful that they got a vaccine pretty quickly, and you could say, well, the government had to be involved in that, but probably not. I mean, Pfizer and Moderna, they're going to make a lot of money on this, and they had have made it without the government being involved. But anyway, and then I tried to find, you know, what was the church's response to all this 100 years ago? And certainly you could say that the churches, in general churches, response to COVID has certainly been mixed. There are still churches that are not meeting corporately in this country, or they're meeting outside exclusively, or they're requiring masks. There's just a whole range. Back then, from what I could ascertain, and that's not in this book, he didn't address that, but there was a lot of churches that got shut down for a time, and some of the pastors were in favor of it. Some of them fought bitterly against it because that was the government saying don't meet. And that was also the restaurants, or, you know, I don't know how many restaurants were around back then. There were probably more bar joints and stuff more than restaurants. But yeah, saloons, that's the word. And, but they were shut down. The gambling halls were shut down. Any place where people would gather shut down. Now, we didn't have Walmarts back then. We didn't, you know, people didn't shop for groceries back then the way they do now. There just wasn't all that available. But they did try to shut down what they could. The churches came back up probably within a month or two. They may have been shut down longer than what ours was. But it was mixed. It was interesting, and again, it wasn't like the Catholics thought this and the Protestants thought that. So anyway, I just don't think, so this book and I forget how much we paid for it, but it goes through how viruses work, and you don't have to go to med school to understand it, and I think that's valuable to know. It goes through the spread of the disease, the political ramifications of the disease. Getting back to the name Spanish flu, Spain was neutral in World War I. So the newspapers were not allowed to report that it came out of the U.S. or where the hotbeds were. So if you just read the newspapers, it sounded like the worst of the flu was in Spain because they still had a fairly free press, and they were reporting how bad it was. So that's where it got the name Spanish flu. But in no way did it start in Spain. Towards the end of the book, this book was written in around 2000, and it was updated in 2015, so pre-COVID. And the author outlines, what could we learn and what did we learn. And I appreciated his take on it because he said that the government tries to manage information, and that's never good. And he compared it to like a horror movie where there's this unseen monster, and that's where it's really scary, what you don't know. But once you see the monster, you can start dealing with it and, how to defeat it and all that. So if we would just get the information out there. But anyway, it's a thick book, but it's easy to read. The Great Influenza by John Barry. So COVID has been hard for all of us. It's touched nearly all of us. I know my wife said early on, it just didn't seem real because she didn't know anybody that had COVID. That was a long time ago that she said that. And that's all changed, of course. But we're Bible-believing Christians, and we're not supposed to be like the rest of the world. We're not supposed to be afraid of death. We're supposed to want to have corporate worship. How are we to deal with this? Or how are we supposed to deal with it if it goes on for another year? What if they want to shut the churches down again? What if they mandate masks again? I know they're messing with the schools again, locally. What should our response be? I had in here that we have a great ability to access medical facts and opinions, but a minimal ability to tell the difference. That's a change from 100 years ago. Other than your neighbor in a newspaper, they didn't, no TV. That was before radio got invented, I believe. So people just didn't have that much access to information. We have tons of access now. What do we do with that? One of the issues for Christians is the whole thing about submitting to the government authorities. I know many in this church have struggled with that. We as a session have debated that. How does one handle that? So we're going to have a few minutes here, and I have a mic if people want to comment or ask questions. I was asked a question prior to the class starting about the vaccines. So here's the medical skinny on that. The vaccine was made for a specific coronavirus that was actually already mutated from what showed up in Wuhan. And so this Delta variant, which is what most of it is out there now, it was not made specifically for that Delta variant, and I'm sure there's people working around the clock trying to get something more specific to that. But it will mutate again. There's been several mutations, and that's what viruses do. Viruses do not mutate because we invented a vaccine. They're stupid. They don't have a brain. Viruses just mutate. And if they mutate 100 times and one of them is able to get into the body and stay there, that's the one that lasts. So I've heard things on the news about how the virus is smart, or the virus, no. Viruses are stupid. So, so anyway, in most of the world, and including the United States, the people who are in the hospital, the sickest, it does seem to be the Delta variant, and it's predominantly unvaccinated people. So the vaccine still seems to be able to protect against serious illness in the people most vulnerable. So it is helping keep people out of the hospital. Carlisle Hospital locally, where I work, had over 40 people at one time there for a lot of this winter. It was terrible. And then for about a month, we had nobody this summer. And now it's been anywhere from 2 to 4 to 5. And again, I don't think any of them have been vaccinated. It is still possible, vaccines aren't perfect, that you could get the vaccine and still get sick enough to be in the hospital or die. When they said the vaccine was 90% effective, that set a record, because most everything else we get vaccinated to is about 70% effective, like measles and mumps and such. I've never seen so much gossip and rumors and all that as I have about these vaccines in terms of the damage they can cause and all that. Certainly there are people out there that have the vaccine and have side effects from the vaccine. That's, kind of like if you take a penicillin and you're allergic to it, people have died from taking antibiotics from side effects. But I truly believe the vaccine's done much more good than harm. And I feel bad for the people that were adversely affected, but it's a really minuscule part of the population. Any other questions? Any comments?
Just to clarify, how large is Carlisle Hospital?
Carlisle Hospital is licensed for over 100 beds, but we have enough staff for about 80 beds because of the nursing shortage. So yeah. So it was about half the patients this winter were COVID. We had to expand the ICU. It's a 12-bed ICU, and we had to expand that out into the next hallway. I'm not sure we ever had more than 12 people on ventilators at a time, but yeah, so. Yes, you do.
As far as conversations or documents that need to be tended to immediately, what would be the top 3?
So the top 3 documents would be a will, if you don't have it, because that determines either where your children go and where your stuff goes, what you want done with it. And then I would say the medical and financial power of attorney. So, and again, that doesn't take place or doesn't kick in until you're disabled, and most people have their spouse, if they're married, as their power of attorney. I would choose someone other than a spouse for the executor, because it doesn't make sense. If I pass away, Laura Lee gets my stuff, and so we don't have to disperse it. She'll start dispersing all my cars, I know that real quick. But we have 1 minute. So
You said power of attorney.
yeah.
I would point out that when your child turns 18, they are on their own, that under the law, the parent no longer can make the decision. So as the 18th birthday approaches, you want to get that power of attorney in place, because even if the kid is a little bit sick, mom and dad need access to make the decisions.
Yes, spoken like a lawyer. Thank you. Steve, you can have the last word.
Yeah, I have a question about, let's just say, here, most of us, now we're not wearing masks here.
Right.
And if they come out and say, well, you got to shut down the church again, what would you do? I would say keep it open. John MacArthur did. Many of you know John MacArthur. And I really respected him for doing that. And what would you do?
I'd have a session meeting.
All right.
Was that a cop-out? Yeah, it's a tough issue. So, okay, so a couple people in the last year have approached me and asked advice on things, and we do have a couple lawyers here in our congregation, and I'm happy to give advice to the best of my ability, or try to lead people in the right direction if they're having issues with some of this stuff. But, okay, well, I hope we benefited, and just remember, God's in control. And that has been so reassuring to me in this, all the time, but certainly in the last 18, 20 months. In spite of what the government does, in spite of what happens medically, and all the bad stuff going on around us, God's still in control. So let's pray. Father, we thank you that you are in control. You know what's going to happen. You know each one of us better than we know ourselves. And may we look to you and the Bible for answers where we can get them, and just give us wisdom, Lord, for things like what Steve asked. Give us wisdom if these things come up again, that we can deal with them in a way that would honor you and glorify you. Now we just pray your hand upon our worship service, and that you would be magnified there.